Hello, everybody, and welcome to Nature Sunshine's Education Week 2018, Knowledge at Your Fingertips. We are so delighted that you are with us on this great Education Week presentation. We're very thankful for your time and your participation. We have a fantastic guest for you today, and we're very excited about the opportunity you have to learn from him. My name is Brian Wall, and I am your webinar host for this event, and I'm very excited to kick off our 2018 Education Week with you, and I look forward to learning and sharing information with you today as well. But let's jump right in and get right to our guest speaker today, Dr. Donald Layman. He is going to be our guest speaker today, and let me share just a little bit about him with you. Dr. Donald Layman is the Professor Emeritus in the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Layman served on the faculty at the University of Illinois from 1977 to 2012. Dr. Layman has been a leader in research about protein and amino acid metabolism, nutrition for athletic performance, obesity, diabetes, and cardiometabolic health. Dr. Layman has over 100 peer-reviewed publications. He has received numerous awards for his research and nutrition teaching, so you're going to have a fantastic event with him today. Dr. Layman served as associate editor of the Journal of Nutrition from 1989 through 1993, and he currently serves as associate editor of the Journal of Nutrition, Education, and Behavior, and on the editorial board of Nutrition and Metabolism, Journal of American College of Nutrition, and Nutrition Research and Practice, and is a consultant to numerous food companies and commodity organizations. Dr. Layman earned his BS and MS degree in chemistry at Illinois State University and his doctorate in human nutrition at the University of Minnesota. So you can see here that Nature Sunshine has once again brought to you the leading and great education at your fingertips. It is so important for us to become educated and understand the influence of protein in our lives, and we're very excited to have this presentation for you. Protein is such a critical part about building a nice, healthy body, and it really is a critical part to building a Nature Sunshine business as well. So what I would like to do then, Dr. Layman, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you. You can jump right into your presentation, and I'll rejoin you at the end of your presentation. So thank you again, Dr. Layman, for joining us and being a part of this great presentation here at Nature Sunshine and kicking off our Education Week. So I will give you controls. You have the floor, Dr. Layman.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks to everybody out there for joining us. As Brian said, we're going to take a bit of a deep dive into the world of protein today, which is sort of where I live. I like this title, Optimizing Protein in a Carbohydrate World. Protein is actually one of the most difficult nutrients and most important to get. We can live a long time without a lot of different vitamins or minerals, but we basically won't last very long without protein. So understanding the right amount is important. And yet basically everything around us is a carbohydrate world. We're sort of deluged with breads and rice and chips and French fries and pastries and donuts, and you can go on and on about carbohydrates, but protein's a little more difficult to get. And one of the things that sort of has been going on in the last 10 to 15 years is we've gotten a whole new feeling and understanding about protein. And frankly, the average consumer is fairly confused about nutrition. They walk into the grocery store and say, gee, you know, it used to be cholesterol was bad for me, and the average American decreased their egg consumption by over 35%. And all of a sudden, we had huge problems with macular degeneration and Alzheimer's and other things. And now, all of a sudden, eggs are actually good for you. Cholesterol is not a bad thing. Saturated fat used to be sort of the leading cause of heart disease, but now we realize it's really only when it's confronted with a lot of carbohydrates. And we used to think about protein was bad for you in some form. One of the things we've heard a lot about is, well, adults eat more protein than they need. That's actually a myth. We need to really think about that. And so let's sort of start walking into the protein topic and think about what this statement actually means. I think the first thing to look at is really kind of a definition of how much protein we think is a requirement. And if you know about nutrition, then you've probably heard of the recommended dietary allowances, the RDAs. It's important to think about the definition of that RDA. It's the lowest level of a nutrient, in this case protein, the lowest level of protein that will balance the losses of nitrogen from the body in persons at energy balance with modest physical activity. If we take that statement apart a little bit and think about it, it's the minimum level. It's the lowest level that will balance nitrogen. Nitrogen actually was first used way back in the 20s because it was the only thing people could measure at that time, and it was a fairly good representation of growth. But the reality is it doesn't have much of a relationship to health. Nitrogen balance doesn't have any relationship to heart disease or cancer or obesity or diabetes. And so it's a measure that actually has kind of an odd representation. And then the rest of it is people who are in energy balance. Well, we know that over 55% of Americans are overweight, so they're not in energy balance. And we know that 75% of Americans are considered sedentary, so they don't have modest physical activity. So all in all, we have a definition of a requirement that probably fits a very small percentage of people. So we need to back up just a little bit more and ask, what are we really looking for? Are we looking for a minimum amount to prevent deficiencies, or are we really asking about an optimum amount for health? Back in 2002, the National Academy of Science, the Institute of Medicine there, basically established what are called dietary reference intakes. And what they wanted to emphasize at that time is nutrition is really a range. It goes from a minimum intake, which they defined as that RDA, minimum that would prevents a deficiency, up to some upper limit, a UL, where somewhere above that there might be a risk of some sort of adverse effect or a toxicity. And in between that, we have what's called an acceptable range. We're pretty good about thinking about that kind of an idea for something like vitamin C. Everybody, we know we can prevent scurvy, a deficiency of vitamin C, with 60 milligrams of vitamin C per day. And everybody, who takes vitamin C supplements is perfectly happy taking a gram or 6 grams or even 10 grams. We'll take 1,000 times above the RDA with vitamin C and never think about it. Vitamin D is the same thing. We prevent rickets with 400 international units, but a lot of people are perfectly comfortable taking 4,000 units a day. So for certain nutrients, we kind of understand that. But for protein, for whatever reason, we kind of religiously believe that we need to stay down at the RDA. If we take in protein anywhere above the RDA, it's too much. And so right now, the blue P there for protein, we're just above the RDA. For women, the RDA is established as 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight, so it relates to your weight. But for most people, assuming sort of normal body weight, that'd be somewhere around 60 grams of protein per day, maybe 65 or whatever. The average American woman's taking in about 68, and the average American male's taking in about 90. And so what we're going to be talking about is not taking in outrageous amounts. You see the upper limit for protein is somewhere well above 200 grams per day, 3.0 grams per kg before you get into any sort of a risk. We're going to talk about just moving it up a little. So when we use the term higher protein diets or high protein diets, it's always important to keep in perspective, we're not talking outrageous amounts. We're talking about just a little bit higher above the minimum RDA. As I mentioned, one of the things that has gone on in the last, really, since 2010 is a huge paradigm shift in nutrition. For literally 60 years, really post-World War II, nutrition's all been about fear of fat. It's all been about heart disease. It's been about minimizing cholesterol, minimizing saturated fat, and eating lots of grains. So avoid the top of the pyramid, eat at the bottom. And that's pretty what Americans have done. Unfortunately, as we did that more and more and distorted the American diet, what we found is we generated epidemics of obesity and diabetes. The National Institute of Health and the USDA went back and looked at that, and in 2010, they realized those guidelines were really, really distorting the American diet. And they dropped the food guide pyramid without much news, I might add. They didn't really want to admit that they were wrong. And they created what's called My Plate. And I think if you just sort of look at the difference in those two, one of the things you recognize right away is front and center are vegetables, which I think we'll all agree on. But right front and center is protein. Everything else has always been food groups, and now we have emphasized a single nutrient, protein, right in the front of the plate. The other thing I want to highlight before I leave this slide is that back with the food guide pyramid, we emphasize servings per day. And now with My Plate, what we're now beginning to do is emphasize a meal focus. What should it look like when I sit down to eat? What should my plate actually look like? So we're going to sort of emphasize that plate concept as we go along. Okay, so what's new in protein research? One of the things that has happened in the last, really, since about the turn of the century, about 2000, as we have shifted over toward a healthy aging concept, and one of the things we think a lot about now is healthy muscle. When we talk about really being a healthy adult and living a long, healthy life, it really relates to how healthy our muscle is. We've actually come up with a new concern, an age-related disease called sarcopenia, which is basically a slow, progressive loss of muscle mass with accumulating fat. That is considered one of the most dangerous things in long-term health. We lose functional mobility, we lose metabolic health. And metabolic health, things like insulin sensitivity, our ability to burn fats, we all are related to our muscle health. So as we've studied protein and muscle health, a couple of things we've learned is that as we get older, our efficiency to use protein declines. We lose our efficiency with protein. And the other is we become more and more dependent on when we eat it, the meal distribution of protein. So I'm going to emphasize those two topics as I go along. One of the things that I like to think of in terms of nutrition is that we really need a muscle-centric view. For years, we thought about nutrition as avoiding something, avoiding cholesterol, avoiding fat. We've had this negative view of nutrition. We had too much body fat. We needed to avoid fat. A muscle-centric view is actually a positive effect. What we want to do is view how do we best nourish muscle to stay healthy. It was kind of a really nice review by Bob Wolf back in 2006, and he had a review published in American Journal of Clinical Nutrition for those of you who like to read original research. It's called The Underappreciated Role of Muscle in Health and Disease. And it really went in and talked about the relationship of muscle to obesity, to diabetes, to heart disease, to cancer, etc. And that's kind of the approach that, I'll be taking. As we look at sort of metabolic advantages of protein, one of the things that we want to keep in mind is, are we looking at just adding protein on top of a diet, or are we looking at making diet changes? And so I want you to always think about what we want when we talk about protein is we want to replace carbohydrates. We're not just adding, if we have an unhealthy diet and we just add protein on top of it, it's probably still an unhealthy diet. But what we want to do is use protein to make a diet more healthy. And when we do that, one of the things we find is that adding a higher protein and reducing carbohydrates, you'll almost always improve body composition. It helps protect muscle, helps keep it more metabolically active, and it targets specifically fat use and fat loss. It also helps to enhance satiety, reduces your desire for snacking, helps you target how much food you're going to eat. Also, along with that change, higher protein and lower carbohydrates, we have a big effect on reducing the prediabetes condition called metabolic syndrome. We'll lower triglycerides, improve our blood lipids, increase HDL, lower fasting blood glucose, reduce your postprandial insulin. All of the things would go with reducing that condition of prediabetes. And again, that part is probably related more toward reducing the carbohydrate part. Okay, so let's get back to the protein. Minimum versus optimum. And really the question here is what health outcomes do we want to look for? For years, protein has been defined around growth. I said before that it was measured against nitrogen balance. How much nitrogen do we need? Well, when we're growing, when we're a baby, when we're, early childhood, even through early teenage years, we're growing, nitrogen balance is always accumulating. We're gaining more of it. And so we can always kind of measure that. But in our adult life, we're basically stable. Nitrogen shouldn't be changing. So that measure becomes less important when we're not growing. And the reality is we've never really measured protein requirements after about 20 years of age. Most of the research was done with teenagers or young adults, maybe early college age. And so what we have is an RDA that basically was high when you're young and growing, about 2.2 grams per kg, and then went down to 0.8 at around between 14 and 18 and never changed beyond that. That has been questioned a lot in the last few years. One of the things I want you to think about, we always sort of associate protein with growth. I just want to give you a few numbers on that. Our maximum rate of growth of protein, how much can we accumulate per day, is about 4 grams. And so as I said before, the average intake for protein, the RDA is around 60 grams. Our average intake's around 70 to 80. But we're only gaining about 4 grams per day as maximum growth. So what's the relationship there? Even more important, if you step back, throughout our entire body or our entire life, we're constantly changing our body protein. In fact, about every 8 months, we replace every protein in our body. Think about that. About every 8 months, we replace every protein in our body. That means the body is making somewhere between 250 to 300 grams of new protein per day. Think about that. We're only eating 60 to 90, but we're making 300. That means the association between dietary protein and growth is really poor. It has a lot of other uses, and that's what I want to talk about. One of the other things to understand is this meal effect of protein. When you think about different organs in the body, they all have protein turnover, protein metabolism in different ways. For example, in your heart is constantly making new protein because it's working all the time. Your liver, constantly making new protein. So whether you're sleeping in the middle of the night or just after you ate, your heart and your liver are still doing the same thing. You could be starving for 2 weeks and your heart still has to make protein or you'll die. Muscle, on the other hand, is much more of a selective process. There's so much of it. The body chooses to trigger protein synthesis in muscle after a meal, after you've eaten a meal that has the right nutrients in it. And so what I've shown in this picture is just sort of the oscillating aspect that after a meal, protein synthesis will go up in a muscle, and then in between meals, it comes back down. We go from what's called an anabolic period after the meal to a catabolic. We're actually breaking down muscle protein. In the middle of the night, we're breaking down protein. So that first meal in the day becomes very important. How long do these meal effects last? They only last about 2.5 hours. So after each meal you eat, you get about a 2.5 hour window. Your body is building protein and muscle. And then it will go catabolic for a while, and you can reset that machinery in about 5 hours. So spacing meals at about 5 hour intervals becomes very important. Okay, so let's start thinking about this protein in meals. There was a really interesting series of experiments, and it was done in multiple labs around the world back around the early 2000s. This one happens to be from some colleague friends of mine in Galveston, 2005. And what they did was they took some young adults, about 22 to 25, and some older adults, 65 to 70, and they fed them a breakfast meal. This breakfast meal contained 15 grams of protein. And as you can see from the bars, the young had a very robust stimulation of muscle protein synthesis, but with this exact same meal, the elderly had almost nothing. This was a huge revelation to us understanding protein metabolism. We began to realize that young adults have a different need for protein than older adults. What we now realize is that as we get older, our efficiency of use of protein goes down. At this point, we don't fully understand why. There's a variety of reasons that may be true. One of the things we know happens is that our blood flow, our capillary blood flow goes down as we get older. We just don't circulate blood in our peripheral areas as well. And so the body doesn't deliver oxygen and nutrients and amino acids to the tissues as well. We know that's happening. There's also a decrease in gene expression of transport, so we don't transport things into cells as well. And the third is that our signaling, the metabolic signaling in the body gets less efficient. We don't know the relative importance of these. I think all three are important. I'm going to talk about the third one today because I think that one's really important, and it's actually the area of my research. Okay, a little bit of background. I'm sure a lot of you know about protein and amino acids, but just so everybody's on the same page, I think an important question to ask is, why do we need dietary protein? Why do we eat protein? We don't actually need protein. What we need are the building blocks of protein called amino acids. There are 20 naturally occurring amino acids that we need, and I've listed them there just by their three-letter abbreviations. I'm not going to go into detail about all of them, but I do want to highlight one or two. On the left, we have what are called non-essential amino acids. That doesn't mean to imply we don't need them. What it actually means is we can make them in our body, so we don't actually have to eat those. On the right side, we have what are called essential amino acids. Those 9 we have to have as a daily supply in our diet. And I've highlighted 5 at the top in the green there as limiting amino acids. These are ones that are the hardest to get. And they are almost always limiting in plant foods. Plants have proteins that are designed for the health of the plant, and animals have proteins that are designed for health of animals. And so when you look at plants, they're almost always limiting or sometimes even deficient in one or more of those 5. I'm going to come back to that topic later. Okay, so we need these amino acids. Why do we need them? At the bottom of the slide, there's 2 reasons. One is we need them for building new proteins in the body. And you may have heard them as talked about as building blocks. Okay, so that's the first need for protein. And that's the one that actually relates closest to the minimum need, the RDA. And then we have other roles of amino acids, lots of them, multiple other metabolic roles, and all of those relate to how much protein we actually take in. And so that I'm going to show you the difference between these two, the minimum need as a building block versus other roles as metabolic roles. To do that, I want to talk about one specific amino acid, and that's leucine. And this is one I've done a lot of research. And it's actually part of a group of amino acids, valine, isoleucine, and they make up what are called the branch chain amino acids. These 3 are very important to muscle health, and I'm going to sort of show you that as we go along. So we're going to highlight. It doesn't mean that the others aren't equally important, and I could make up similar stories with lysine or tryptophan or others, but I'm going to focus on the one, leucine, which we probably know the most about. Okay, metabolic signaling. I've been talking about that a little bit. So here's just a brief sort of summary of some of them. Top right-hand corner, amino acids have an effect on gut health. So some of the amino acids like phenylalanine and tryptophan trigger hormones from the gut. Next to it, neurotransmitters. Amino acids like tryptophan or tyrosine will trigger neurotransmitters like serotonin. So all of these are related to amino acids. Down at the bottom, vascular health, nitric oxide. Arginine is an amino acid that's a direct precursor to nitric oxide. And the one I'm going to talk about over on the right side is the leucine link to mTOR and protein synthesis. So before I leave the slide, the one thing I want to emphasize here is that all of these signaling elements relate to how much of that amino acid is present in the blood. So if you eat a really low protein diet, all of these signaling mechanisms are downregulated. They're reduced in emphasis. If you eat a higher protein diet, they become more important. You can choose either one. The body can work either way, but it changes how the body works. Okay, so let's go back to that picture I showed you a minute ago. So this was from the Galveston group, the young versus the elderly in protein synthesis. And what we now have learned is that while aging reduces the efficiency of protein use, it doesn't reduce the capacity to respond. So the same group came back and did a study a little later, and in the white bar now we have the young, and in the black bar the elderly. And this is after an overnight fast, so this is when you wake up in the morning before the meal. And then they gave them a meal, and now the meal had 32 grams of protein, so twice as much. And what you can see is the elderly responded just the same as the young. So when we gave only 15 grams, the elderly got basically no response to the breakfast meal. But when we gave 32 grams, they responded just as well as the young folks. So this is the issue of protein needs and the efficiency, the change in efficiency. We've gone on to study that more, and we now know that it really relates to the essential amino acids in the protein. And basically, from those numbers, you can see that the essential amino acids make up about half of the protein. So 30 grams of protein is about 15 grams of essential amino acids. But they've gone on even farther. We've looked at, and we now know that the amino acid that really is responsible for this signaling difference is leucine. And so I'm going to talk about that. So the next slide, I have a very complex metabolic slide, and this is basically what I do for fun. So this is a complex metabolic signaling slide. Right in the middle of it, you see a green oval and that word mTOR, M-T-O-R-C-1, mTOR's complex 1. And this is kind of like Grand Central Station for signaling. There's lots of different inputs, and once you trigger this signal, it then goes on downstream through what we call initiation factors, and it triggers muscle protein synthesis. I'm going to simplify this slide in a minute, but I just want to go across the top. So this signal, this mTOR, is integrating a lot of different signals. It's recognizing how much protein you eat in the form of leucine, that amino acid. It's recognizing other things like growth hormones in the form of insulin or growth hormone or IGF-1. It's recognizing how much energy is coming in the diet, mostly in the form of glucose and insulin. And it's recognizing other kinds of stresses, for example, exercise status. It takes all of these different things and says, okay, the muscle is in a good enough situation, we can trigger this really expensive process called protein synthesis, and we'll initiate it. Okay, so that's a big rundown. Let's simplify it. I want to make 2 points about this. So here's our mTOR triggering protein synthesis, and I've simplified it down to insulin, kind of carbohydrates in the meal, and growth hormones, and leucine, protein in the meal. When we're young and growing, this mechanism relies mostly on insulin. Whoops, back up one. It relies mostly on insulin. You can take a young child with a relatively poor diet, and that child will still grow. The child is protected by growth hormones. All of the hormones will allow that child to develop, maybe not as well as normal, but still develop. This is sort of a reproductive survival trait for the human beings. We have hormones that will protect us, and they protect us into our probably about 30, through our 20s and into probably about 30. Once we turn 30, hormones really aren't our friend much anymore, and now we rely more on the quality of the diet. So this equation now shifts over to the leucine in the diet, how much protein at each meal. I want to emphasize that issue between young and old with two graphs. The first one you can see is from protein synthesis with 22-year-olds, protein synthesis over here, and protein amount in the diet, the meal down here. And what you can see is that 5-gram meal, 10-gram meal, and 20-gram meal, you get stimulations of protein synthesis. So in that slide I showed you a little while ago, a 15-gram breakfast meal was a pretty good protein response. And it probably plateaus at 20. So this is with the young adult. But now we'll look at the older adult. Just so you can remember the other slide, I'll put it up here. Now we look at 10 grams, there's absolutely no response at all in the older adult. 20 gram, no response at all. It takes 30 grams before you trigger this meal threshold for protein synthesis. And it takes probably 40 grams before you really begin to plateau it. So a big difference between the young adult and the old adult as to the amount of protein to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And within that, we know that it takes about the relationship of 30 grams of protein. Leucine makes up about 8% of a mixed diet. So 30 grams of protein will get you about 2.5 grams of leucine, and that seems to be the trigger level. How well is this being accepted? Oh, well, first, one other thing first. How important is this? One of the things we know is that the typical American diet is very unbalanced in protein. Most Americans will eat the majority of their protein late at night, after 7 o'clock. We know that most Americans eat about 65% of their protein after 7 o'clock, and they have very low protein intake at breakfast. The average American breakfast ranges between 8 and 12 grams of protein. So if it takes 30 grams to make an effect, we know that most Americans are waking up, very small protein breakfast, they don't stimulate, they stay catabolic, just like they're fasting. Lunch, they'll have their salad, still too low, and finally they have their dinner meal where they get enough protein to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Remember, a meal only has a 2.5 hour effect. So we're basically staying catabolic. We're in a negative nitrogen balance for 22 hours a day, and we're in a positive balance for 2. What we hypothesized is if we change the pattern, so the pattern here was 90 grams of protein per day, if we did the same thing with 90 grams of protein but distributed it evenly at 30 per meal, we hypothesized adults would be healthier. So my colleague Doug Patton-Jones and I ran that exact experiment. And so this is the balanced where the meals each had 30. And we brought these individuals into our laboratory. We kept them in the research unit for 7 days. So we fed them everything they ate. And we looked at their protein synthesis after the breakfast meal, in a 24-hour day. And what we found is when we distributed it evenly, 30 grams per meal, they had more net protein synthesis in muscle than if it was skewed like most Americans. So again, they're eating exactly the same amount, exactly 90 grams in both cases, but they got more benefit by distributing it, reaching that minimum threshold at each meal. Sometimes you'll hear that referred to as an even distribution, and that's not really the term. The term is reaching the threshold. The threshold is somewhere between 25 and 35 grams of protein. So you can have an even distribution of 60 grams, so 20 at each meal, and it won't work at all. So it's not about an even distribution. It's about reaching the threshold of about 30 grams. Okay, so how well is this being accepted? This was an international forum of experts in working with older adults. It's referred to as the PROAGE study. And they basically said that adults should be eating 30 grams of protein per meal, focused on 2.5 grams of leucine per meal, and 1.2 to 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. So we're talking about daily intakes that are about twice the RDA, but we're focusing on 30 grams per meal. About this point, when I've talked about leucine and protein, everybody says, well, if leucine's so important, where do you get it? So now we sort of get into the issue of protein quality, and this is important to think about. This is just a small list of proteins, but just to give you sort of an idea. Leucine in general, if you take a mixed meal, we usually say it makes up about 8% of the protein, but you can see proteins aren't equal. And one of the things to look at is that all of the animal proteins are at the top of the list and all of the plant proteins are at the bottom. And that doesn't mean that, plant proteins are bad. It just means that they have lower amounts of these essential amino acids. And so if you just make a direct comparison, for example, of whey protein, you can get along with a meal that would contain whey protein at about 23 grams of whey protein will give you a maximum muscle effect. But if you took soy protein, on the other hand, it'll take about 33 grams. You can get the same effect. They're equally effective, but you always have to remember you have to consume more of the plant protein to be equal. I highlighted meats here in the middle. I just want to make one other point about it. Meats in general are all about the same. So whether you're talking about chicken or pork or beef or fish, they're all basically meat proteins. The one difference is that if they are gravity species that walk around on land, they will generate about 8 grams of protein per ounce, where fish that float in water only have about 5 grams protein per ounce. So if you're using fish as a protein source, for example, 4 ounces of chicken, you'd need 6 ounces of fish to be equal to it. So again, these are some of the issues of protein quality that we need to keep in mind. Okay, so I've been talking about mTOR, protein synthesis. I want to just make this a little bit more complicated. We've talked about the need for amino acids as building blocks for protein, but then we also talked about it as signaling elements like with mTOR. Well, amino acids actually have lots of other metabolic roles. And for leucine, here's a list. Whoops. Leucine also helps to stabilize blood glucose through a process of recycling an amino acid known as alanine. It also helps to stimulate fat oxidation in the body by a transport molecule known as CPT1. It helps to maintain your mitochondria through a process known as anabolic maintenance or anaplerotic maintenance of the TCA cycle. I'm going to show you these in a minute. It helps to maintain our immune system by providing an amino acid known as glutamine, which is a primary fuel. And it helps to maintain vascular function by producing an amino acid known as arginine for nitric oxide. So this is a long list of metabolic functions. And once again, it relates to how much leucine you consume. If you consume low amounts, these processes are all minimized. If you consume higher amounts, we optimize them. Okay, so I'm going to show you this in a few steps. First one is sort of everything together just to show you how complex this is. So here's a test that we'll do a quiz on this at the end. But basically, this is leucine and all of its metabolic roles. And you can see the sort of the mTOR one up at the middle, up at the top. Let me simplify this and go through it by steps. Okay, so what we've already talked about is leucine stimulates mTOR, and that's for protein synthesis. The big green area in the middle there is our mitochondria, which is where we generate energy. So as leucine concentration, after a meal, as leucine concentration goes up in the blood, goes up in cells, we trigger muscle protein synthesis, but we at the same time also trigger its breakdown. The first step in breakdown of any amino acid is an enzyme known as a transferase, aminotransferase, in this case BCAT, B-C-A-T, it's a transferase. And what that does is it transfers an amino group off of it, the NH3. From there, we can go on down into the mitochondria, and we'll actually burn leucine for energy. It goes down to a molecule known as acetyl-CoA, and we generate energy, ATP. A key enzyme here is called the dehydrogenase, and I put my arrow on it right in the middle, DCKAD, dehydrogenase. It's really interesting that when leucine concentration goes up in the cell, it triggers mTOR for protein synthesis, and at the exact same amount, it triggers the enzyme to break it down. So now what we've got going on is this trigger for synthesis, and we're removing it from the cell at the exact same time. And we're also generating energy that we're going to use for protein synthesis. So the body is coordinating all these things at the same time. Next step, which is kind of cool, is that the body is coordinating it. We can generate acetyl-CoA, we can generate this energy molecule from something like leucine, but we can also generate it from glucose, using glucose. When we do that, glucose can dominate this pathway. So in muscle, people will talk about glucose for exercise. But when leucine goes up, the dehydrogenase will actually inhibit another one, and we begin to recycle the glucose. We begin to recycle the glucose. And basically, instead of taking pyruvate into the TCA cycle, we generate alanine. This goes back to the liver, and we regenerate the glucose. Estimates are that during exercise, about 40% of blood glucose actually comes from this glucose-alanine cycle. The next step is that this same enzyme will also stimulate fatty acid use. And so now we begin to burn more fats. Now what we're beginning to see is this coordination in the body, that when we are choosing the energy for muscle, we're choosing between burning fats or burning glucose. With a higher protein diet, what we're doing is causing the body to burn more fats. And so when we use a higher protein diet, we stimulate protein synthesis, we burn more energy, and we use fats as the fuel for it, so we decrease body fat. That's why higher protein and lower carbohydrate diets are so effective. Next step, this nitrogen, which I mentioned, when it comes off leucine, doesn't actually go directly to alanine. It actually goes to another molecule, alpha-KG, and we form an amino acid called glutamate. From glutamate, we can form glutamine. Glutamine, as I mentioned earlier, is part of our immune system. All of our immune cells, the leukocytes, the neutrophils, the macrophages, the primary fuel is glutamine. Glutamine is really abundant. About 20% of the amino acids in the body are glutamine. And they're very important fuel for a lot of different tissues. Our ability to make glutamine directly relates to how much of the branched-chain amino acid leucine we take in. If we take in small amounts, we'll make smaller amounts of glutamine. And many of you probably have seen supplements of glutamine out there. Why? When even people think about it, it's because their protein diets are too low. Same is true, we can also make arginine for this, which is a source of nitric oxide. The last step in all of this is we tie it back to the branched-chain amino acids. One of the things that happens when you take this alpha-KG out of the TCA cycle, you'll shut down energy metabolism. So when you take it out, you have to replace it with something else. So the next step in this cycle is a molecule called succinyl-CoA. And so when leucine takes out an alpha-KG, valine and isoleucine can put a succinyl-CoA back in. This is called an anaplerotic reaction. When you take something out, you have to replace it. So some of the supplements you'll see out there on the market, you'll hear people say, well, should I just take leucine? And the answer is no, you need to take all three of the branched-chain amino acids because you need to metabolize them in about a 2 to 1-to-1 ratio. So most of the supplements that are good on the market for branched-chain amino acids have leucine, valine, isoleucine in about a 2 to 1-to-1 ratio. Okay, so that's sort of what we've been talking about. Let's sort of summarize that. Currently, the RDA for leucine is about 2 grams. Remember, we need 2.5 grams per meal to make it effective. And so we basically are arguing that we need to move that up to about 8 to 9 grams. Some people even suggest 10 grams. So that's a higher leucine type of diet. Safety, clear up to 35 grams. One of the other things that people always ask about is efficiency in exercise. Exercise in athletes, exercise actually improves the efficiency of protein use. We always think about it for muscle activity and think, well, this guy's really heavily muscled, so he must need more protein. In general, athletes need more protein because they're bigger. Remember, protein relates to body weight. So a 300-pound offensive lineman needs a lot more protein than a 90-pound gymnast. No question about it. But as we think about aging, a young guy versus an older, the older individual actually is less efficient. If we look at protein for athletes, most of the recommendations are from about 1.2 up to 2.0 grams per kg. People who are looking to build muscle should be kind of at the top end of that range. People who are looking to maintain it, more like a distance runner, are usually lower in the range. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about it. I'm going to skip on to a bit about safety. I think I'm going to skip over this slide for a second, just in the need for time. Is protein really safe? We talk a lot about safety for nutrients, and protein one almost always comes up. One of the researchers that has sort of questions this, an individual by the name of Chris Newgard at Duke, and he raised the question about our branched-chain amino acids. Do they cause insulin resistance? And he basically got a lot of press and a lot of news by sort of claiming that fast food burgers were the cause of obesity and insulin resistance. And people have gone on to look at that. One of the things we now know is that if you look at individuals who are obese, who have diabetes, the blood levels of branched-chain amino acids will tend to be high. And so Newgard concluded that the branched-chain amino acids were causing the problem. Other individuals have gone on to look at it. This is a French group with Daniel Tomei, and they sort of asked that kind of chicken or egg question, which came first? Did the metabolic problem happen first, or did the branched-chain amino acids cause it? Researchers have been looking in that. This is a group. Chris Lynch is actually the director of nutrition at the National Institute of Health. He and Sean Adams did a paper, and they basically concluded that the branched-chain amino acids are a metabolic marker for the abnormality. What they concluded was that carbohydrate metabolism has a problem. Too many carbs are blocking those pathways I just showed you and not allowing us to burn fats, and not allowing us to burn the branched-chain amino acids so they accumulate. So again, that's one of the aspects. Most people think that it's important to have enough of the branched-chain amino acids. This raises sort of the question about how you study obesity. Do you take an obese individual and study fat tissue because they're fat? That's sort of studying the pathology of the disease. That's kind of the way medicine works, where you study the symptom. In nutrition, what we want to do is study the cause, and the cause is too many calories, too many carbohydrate calories. Another aspect of the safety is, I almost always have people, certainly medical people, when they say, well, isn't protein bad for your kidneys? The origins of that is people who actually have kidney failure. When you have kidney failure, you have to remove a lot of the solutes in your diet. Whether we're talking about table salt or potassium or urea, you have to remove the things the kidney has to filter. But if you look at people who are healthy, protein actually enhances kidney function. It increases the efficiency. Again, when the National Institute of Health, when the Institute of Medicine looked at protein and aging, what they actually found was that people who had low protein diets were at higher risk for kidney problems than people who had high protein diets. Protein actually enhances kidney function. One of the things that's even a question in dialysis now is when should you go to a lower protein diet? Because immediately when you remove protein from the diet, the kidney shrinks in size and function. And so people now realize that protein is very important for kidney function. Another thing that people will say is, well, isn't protein bad for your bones? The origins of that was way back in the early 70s. There was some studies done, and what they found is with higher protein diets, there was a higher loss of calcium in the urine. And so if you're losing calcium, that would seem like it's bad for your bones. But people who have gone on to look at it have found out that what protein does is it actually increases the efficiency of calcium absorption. Most people normally only absorb about 20 to 30% of the calcium in their diet. But if you have a higher protein diet, you can absorb 40 to 50%. And so the origins of the higher loss of calcium in the urine was actually because you're absorbing more and you actually need to get rid of it. And so what we now realize is that protein is actually very important for bone. If you look at that diagram, the bone matrix, the bone is basically a protein matrix, and on top of the protein, we then will layer calcium on top of it. So first you have to have the protein matrix, and then you have to have the calcium. What we now know is for bone health, for osteoporosis, the most important things are, first is exercise, resistance exercise. Second is adequate protein, and third is calcium. Taking calcium supplements without adequate protein won't do you any good. And then the last thing in terms of safety is probably the issue of protein in cancer. And this has gotten a lot of news in the last year, really. And you see some of these kind of crazy ads. Cancer is the hardest to study because it has a really long lag time. Cancer is caused by a damage to the DNA, which then will develop abnormal cells. And there's usually at least a 20-year lag time between the incidents. So people who smoke early in life will get lung cancer in their 50s. It's a very long lag time. One of the things that I think is really, in the era of fake news is sort of equating meat with tobacco. Meat is the new tobacco. It's important to think about the statistics behind these kinds of comparison. This is what we call epidemiology, and their statistical relationships. If we look at tobacco and the risk of cancer, we get a statistical relationship. It's called a hazard ratio of about 12. And these numbers are a little like thinking about earthquakes. If you think about an earthquake of a 3, it's not a big deal, but the difference between a 7 and an 8 is a really big deal. Well, that's the same with a hazard ratio. A hazard ratio of 1 means there's no risk at all. A 12 means it's a gigantic risk. Well, the hazard ratio for red meat and cancer is 1.3. So it's just barely different than 1 versus tobacco is a 12. So again, in the sense of an earthquake, the difference between these two is truly fake news. There's almost no relationship. Why do we have so much fake news? It's the concept of what we call epidemiology. And this was kind of an interesting paper by a really leading group of nutrition researchers. And what they highlight is that when we do nutrition studies, survey studies, which is what the news media reports on a lot, these are just correlations. And they're based on getting an estimate of what people ate. Generally, they'll do a survey once and they'll ask people what they ate yesterday. And then 20 years later, they'll look and see whether they got cancer or not. And I think most of you will recognize not too many Americans eat the same thing every day for 20 years. The other thing that they recognized in these surveys is people way underreport what they ate. Most people underreport somewhere between 400 and 800 calories per day. And generally what they don't report are snacks. And so if you ask somebody how many eggs you ate per day, they'll give you an exact number. But if you ask somebody how many potato chips they ate per day, they'll miss it by, half the bag. So there's a huge issue here. Generally, when you hear somebody saying something is caused by protein, it's almost always related to carbohydrate intake. So when we think about this, one of the things to recognize is always be on the alert. Are they talking about survey data? Or are they talking about real experimental data? If it's just surveys, these are correlations and have very little relevance to causation. The last thing I want to do is sort of tie this back to carbohydrates. We hear a lot about carbohydrates out there. And, you know, I think the thing to realize is that they're sort of the kind of the good, bad, and the ugly. We hear a lot of negatives about sugar and sucrose and fructose and all sorts of different things, or positives about fiber. The thing to recognize is that sugar in the form of glucose is actually an essential nutrient. We all need it every day. You can hear people talk about keto diets and adapting to ketones, but they're basically not exactly giving the whole truth. We all need about 70 to 90 grams of sugar per day. Absolutely, for our brain, our red blood cells, our kidney. But too much sugar can be toxic. We know it as diabetes. It'll damage every cell in the body. So just like I showed you with that very first graph that we have an RDA to some higher level, what we want to do is always be in the middle. Carbohydrates are good for us, but only up to a point. It's not that they're bad. It's not that they're great. It's we need some, but we have to balance it. So let's look at that for carbohydrates. One of the things that we know for the RDA for carbohydrates is is established at 130 grams per day. 130 grams of carbohydrate per day will allow you to eat 5 servings of vegetables, 2 to 3 servings of fruit, and 3 small servings of grain. A serving's 15 grams. A typical slice of bread is about 25 to 30. So this is 3 half servings of bread. This is a half of cup of rice. Okay? But what Americans are actually doing, what Americans are actually eating is about 300 grams. We're eating almost 3 times the RDA for carbohydrates. And that's why we have obesity. We're eating 3 times our energy need for carbohydrates. So let's think about that for a second. I want you to consider carbohydrates. One is how much do we need? What's a healthy amount versus how many can we tolerate? Where do we get obesity and diabetes? The RDA again is 120. The average American intake is 300, and we're getting obese and diabetes. So we need to think about in between that. How do we decide? The basic difference above 130 grams of carbohydrates is exercise. And I love this graph. Basically, it shows you that your amount of exercise relates to how many carbohydrates you're going to burn versus fat. When we're just sitting around, the body is trying to burn mostly fat, not too much carbohydrate. If we get up and just slowly walk around, we'll probably move up to maybe 20% exercise intensity, sort of walking to the coffee pot, you know, the coffee room down the hall. We'll move up and we'll burn a little more carbohydrate. If we go out for a walk, just kind of a nice steady walk, we'll be about maybe 40% maximum exercise intensity. Heart rate is still fairly low, down in the 80 beats per minute range. We're burning now around maybe 40% of the fuels coming from carbs, 60% from fat. As we go on up in more intense exercise, 70, 80% VO2 max, now we're getting into high intensity. Now we're getting into heart rates of 120 beats per minute, sustained heart rates, 120 beats. Now we're beginning to use mostly carbohydrates. And so now what we're beginning to see is that your carbohydrate need, your carbohydrate use relates to the intensity and amount of exercise you do. Okay, so now we can go back and think about your carbohydrate tolerance. If your beginning need for carbohydrates is 130 grams, and that's really a pretty healthy amount or less, somewhere between 80 and 130 is a great target, that meets all of your nutrition needs. When you go above that, you basically have to earn it with exercise. And you earn that amount of exercise at about 40 grams per hour of exercise with heart rate above 100. Most people don't do that much exercise that rate. So if you go out and exercise for 2 hours per day, you can earn 120 more grams. That would bring you up to 250. Remember, the average American's eating 300 grams of carbohydrates per day. That means the average American needs to be working out 2.5 to 3 hours of exercise per day to justify the carbohydrate intake. One of the other things that we like to teach is that carbohydrate also should be distributed through the day. We like to think of as a meal response, that when you get, and I could go into a lecture about these numbers, but when you get above about 40 grams of carbohydrate in a meal, it requires a really large insulin response. So especially for people who are suffering from metabolic syndrome or diabetes or obesity, we want to try and keep their meal threshold of carbohydrates below 40 grams per meal. You can go above 40 if you have exercise close to the meal, because it helps burn the carbohydrates. But otherwise, we're looking at a lower amount. So if we get into designing diets here to just sort of summarize what I've said today, one of the things that I think we all can agree on is we need vegetables. We need a large serving of healthy, colorful vegetables, broccoli, cauliflower, carrots, and fruit. So we need the vegetables, and we need to minimize the carbohydrates that are in the starchy and sugary form: breads, rice, pastas, cereals, crackers, chips, potatoes. All of those are good energy sources, but you can only eat them in proportion to your exercise expenditure. How many calories do you need? So if we think about designing the diets and summarizing everything, then one of the things we know is there are definitely body composition benefits to higher protein, reduced carb diets. Most of the data points to healthier muscles if we can get our protein intake up above 100 grams per day. Again, smaller you are, it's related to body size, so small women would be low in that range, but 1.2 to 1.5 grams per kg. The evidence also supports meal distribution. We know that most Americans eat plenty of protein at dinner, but they are extremely low at breakfast. We would like to see people get that first meal of the day up above 30 grams of protein. And that first meal, we don't necessarily call it breakfast, we call it the first meal. It's not something that has to occur before 7 in the morning. Your first meal could be at noon. But whatever that first meal is, it needs to be protein oriented. It needs to be muscle centric and protein oriented. Carbohydrates, again, we want to balance it against our protein. How many carbs do you need relate to your exercise? When we're talking with people who are trying to lose weight, we try and get them to look at that plate look and balance the protein part and the grain part, the starch part, at about 1-to-1 in size. If you can get people to recognize that whatever their protein is, whatever it is, whether it's legumes or beans or whether it's meats or chicken or fish, the carbohydrate size can't be bigger than that. How much rice, how much pasta, how much bread, how many chips can you eat? Can't be larger than that. You'll control your calories pretty well. Because protein is so satiating, you'll basically not be able to eat more. If you think about it, if you're eating meat at a meal, can you eat another big piece of meat? But if they bring out dessert at the end of the meal, you can still eat it, right? You can always eat more carbs. And we talked about the meal frequency. So that's a quick rundown of where we've at. The take-home messages, we know that young people have a different balance of protein than older individuals. Older people are less efficient, and young is basically less than 30. Unfortunately, metabolism changes somewhere between our 30s and 40s, so quote, older people or anybody over 30. And we need to balance that protein in a different way, and we're looking to balance this against the carbohydrate. So anyway, I think that was a lot of information, a deep dive into what we know about protein, but hopefully you have a better appreciation for why we need protein, why the amino acids of the protein are important, and why we're talking about this meal distribution. So I want to thank you for joining us today. My pleasure to be with you, and look forward to talking metabolism with you again.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Layman. That was some great information and a wonderful journey down the road to understanding protein and how it matters so much to each of us in our lives. I want to take just a few minutes and go over a couple announcements here at home office, but just really appreciate the information and your approach and how you presented the information. We talked a lot about several different things, but I have jotted down a bunch of notes. I hope you have as well out there in the field. But we talked about the RDA and the guide and how that's the lowest level that will balance the loss of nitrogen. We talked about so many different things, how adults eat more protein than they need, and the myth that is, because we really don't, right? We need to eat more protein, and the effects of eating more protein as we age. And it was also brought to my attention how important programs like our Reset Breakfast program has been in helping us balance when we bring in that protein. And we saw the effects of bringing that in throughout the day and rather than in the evening. So bringing that into balance. Just tons of great information, growth versus aging, the meal effect, and so many different things that you brought to our attention, Dr. Layman. It's such a wonderful pleasure for us to have you as a guest, and I know that the influence of your information today will reach thousands and thousands of lives through our distributors, and we're so grateful for you taking the time to be with us. We have several different things that we want to just remind you of, one of which is that education like this at your fingertips is available all week long. We're going to rebroadcast this presentation. If you enjoyed this presentation today from Dr. Layman, you'll have the opportunity to be able to hear this presentation again tonight at 6 and 8 p.m. 6 and 8 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, of course, is when we will rebroadcast Dr. Layman's presentation. Just such a wonderful, I'm just still thinking about some of the things you taught us today and how important it is for us to have proteins in our diets. With that, I think what I'd like to do is just encourage you to join us throughout the rest of Education Week. We have some fantastic presenters. And again, this presentation will be rebroadcast today, Monday, at 6 p.m. and again at 8 p.m. So we just appreciate you joining us on Education Week. Knowledge at your fingertips, nature, sunshine. So grateful for you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a blessed day.